Hi, Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec here. Wanted to discuss very quickly the new appointment of a new head of the Vulnerability Equities Process at the White House. As you probably know, that title used to sit with Rob Joyce, who obviously came out of the National Security Agency. I believe he's returned there since, where that post is the Vulnerability Equities Process has generally been unfilled since then. It's no secret, by the way, and I published this earlier today on Twitter, that I didn't agree with 100% of Rob's decisions. Obviously, that kind of say blew up a little bit in January there, where we had a little back and forth. I have great respect for Rob, by the way, and I want to set that record straight as well. But I wanted to quickly talk about the person who's replacing him there and taking over the helm, Grant Schneider. Grant Schneider is, without a doubt, a very well equipped senior executive in his own right. But I think it's important for us to consider what the Vulnerability Equities Process actually is. The VEP is designed basically to, when we discover a vulnerability in our vulnerability research, regardless of which agency specifically discovers that, whether it's NSA, FBI, etc., whether they discover or purchase, whatever the case is, there's always a question of, are we going to use that for offensive purposes, or are we going to turn it over so that we can get patches set up for our own infrastructure, right? One of the ways that I think publicly this may have gone horribly wrong, you may consider Eternal Blue. Right? We saw Eternal Blue being reused in WannaCry and the NotPetya attacks, at least ostensibly, this is something that would have gone through the Vulnerability Equities Process. Of course, again, I have no actual insight on this, just that it was leaked through the shadow brokers, where it was subsequently used in a number of large-scale cyber attacks. But again, it's widely attributed back to the National Security Agency. Right? So you'll notice I'm being very, very careful there in the wording. Bottom line here, I want to talk quickly about Schneider's experience and why I think that this is a significant and something for us to watch, as he takes the helm of, basically that senior spot on the Vulnerability Equities Process. Schneider, up until 2014, had 20 plus years at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Some of his titles included, Program Finance Manager, IT Resource Management Group, the Chief of the IT Operations Group, and then finally Chief Information Officer of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And again, all of this is open source from LinkedIn. At that point, he moved over to be the Federal Cybersecurity Advisor, Senior Advisor to the Director of OPM. How interesting there, by the way, right? I mean, OPM kind of, anyway, so he was there from June 2015 to January 2016, moved over as the Director of Government Cybersecurity, finally the Deputy Federal CISO, and finally is now the Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy over at the White House, right? Again, as we start talking about his background, one of the things I want you to note there is that there's no actual offensive experience, at least nothing publicly stated there, and honestly no reason to believe that he has any offensive cyber experience there in his, basically in his background. I think this is significant because according to, the White House's, public statements about the Vulnerability Equities Process, the default position for the VEP is to release a vulnerability. Right? So by release, we mean release back to the vendors so it can be patched. If that's the default behavior, then we are looking really for somebody to come in with a, at least with some type of offensive bent, I would say, really to argue, almost like an amicus brief, if you will, to argue for the intelligence use of that particular vulnerability. Now look, I know that there are people out there that are going to play both sides of this. I know there are people that believe very strongly that we should, withhold any O-days that we have and use those to go beat the bad guys and do intelligence work. I think it's no secret, by the way, again, that I was used to be an NSA hacker. That's pretty well publicly known at this point. Look, and there's other people that say 100% of the time, you got to get that out there. You got to make sure that everybody can patch because otherwise we're making the world less safe, right? I'm not going to take a policy stance on this other than to say that, again, there are, we have legitimate reasons that we need to get foreign intelligence. I don't think anybody can argue with that. And the reality is that these vulnerabilities play an important part in collecting that foreign intelligence. Again, as we start to discover some of these vulnerabilities, of course, only time is going to tell as Schneider takes the helm of the VEP, how his influence in the VEP ultimately changes and more or less modifies policy and how we do things. So, again, as a personal thing, as a personal preference, I would prefer to have somebody at a senior position on the VEP, preferably at the top of the VEP, that is arguing for, ultimately arguing for retaining capabilities, at least for a period of time, right? And a lot of times people look at the VEP as a binary process, and I would always encourage people not necessarily to do that. It's not always a question of release or don't release. In many cases, it can be a question of how long should something be used operationally before it's ultimately released to a vendor to be patched, right? So, again, it could be a case where someone looks at a vulnerability and says, cool, we're going to go ahead and use this to collect foreign intelligence for maybe 90 days, at which point maybe then it should be released to vendors for patching. Of course, there's a whole separate issue with discovery and detection courses of action, doing some post hoc, forensics to try to say, was this ever exploited, and as retention of full packet capture continues to increase in a lot of government and, larger enterprise-style organizations, obviously this gets to be a little bit more complicated, right? Look, I don't have all the answers here, but I did want to kind of express, for those that are hearing about Schneider taking over the VEP, wondering what does this mean? My prediction here is that we're going to see a probably a little bit more gravitation towards basically towards releasing some of these vulnerabilities that are discovered. And this is kind of an interesting thing to look at, because the reality is that we don't know how many vulnerabilities are withheld by the VEP. Of course, all we hear about, and again, oftentimes not even directly, basically are the ones that are released, right? So again, this is kind of an interesting, interesting dichotomy here. But again, I'll tell you this: my personal preference. I would absolutely want somebody, again, like Rob Joyce or someone else who has that offensive experience, leading and speaking very loudly from the top. Here's why we need to retain these capabilities. Because if you've been a defender your entire career, and every piece of, honestly, every piece of this says that Schneider has, it looks like at least his entire career at DIA, he was entirely working on defense, right? Chief Information Security Officer, Chief Information Officer, looking at the chief of the IT group, an IT resource group, and project and finance manager. Again, as we look at that, that says a lot of defense without saying a lot of offense, and I worry there again that with that we're missing that perspective, right, of the why. It's very easy to say, for somebody to say, hey, this is why we need to retain a capability. I think it's something completely different for having that firsthand experience of, this is the impact of having held one of these back. We saw the operations go, and we predict that by holding this vulnerability back, we will have similar success in the intelligence, the intelligence sphere. While I'm sure that Schneider is going to be read in to hear a lot of those success stories, again, there's a difference between hearing a story and living a story. I think it's important to note that Rob Joyce, lived that story, and on the other side, as we look at Schneider, I think at best he's hearing these stories. And again, I think that's a critical frame of reference here for somebody leading the vulnerability equities process. Anyway, hope this makes sense, or at least gives you some perspective, into why a selection for the VEP chief is particularly important. In any case, peace out. Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec, signing off.